Hey YouTube, what's up? It's me, Amaxter, and we're back with episode 18 of Behind the Mod. For this episode, we have two lead developers of the Sponge project, Mumfrey and Gabizou, joining us. Hello.
Hi there.
Hello.
Hey, so Sponge, and for those of you who don't know, can you explain what Sponge is?
Well, Sponge is a relatively new API for developing plugins against Minecraft modding. Well, not against Minecraft modding, but for Minecraft modding, without the requirement of having client mods installed specifically on to join a Sponge server. Sponge was born after Bucket's death in 2014, and the API is completely redesigned. It's written from scratch by a great many developers, and it is both compatible with being a standalone Sponge Vanilla server, or it can be installed as Sponge Forge with obviously a Forge installation to manage mods.
Yeah, I mean, Sponge, I think, is a project that's been pretty popular in our community for a few years now, and obviously, you two and lots of other, high-profile people in the community are involved with it. So, I guess, respectively, when did both of you get involved with the project?
Well, Adam, how did you get involved?
I just there was immediately following the bucket shutdown, if you like. The community actually all rallied together in an IRC channel called Next Step, which was basically an IRC discussion established with an intention of figuring out what to do next. Essentially what the next step was going to be. That was headed up by some fairly community heavyweights like SK89Q, who wrote about Edit, and a few others. And essentially, it was decided as a result of that meeting to start Sponge as a project. That was the actual outcome of a few hectic days of basically IRC back and forth. And I was one of the first. There were about 20 odd people who were kind of the founders, if you like, of the project, and I was kind of on board from day one because I wanted to bring the experience I had from Lightloader over, which was largely, bytecode engineering, the stuff that eventually turned into mixin. And I think it's fair to say that I also dragged Gabizou in because I know that he's an extremely accomplished coder, and basically coerced him into coming to help us. And he then kind of realized what a contribution he could make and became a Sponge leader in the end. So that was how we both kind of started. I just sort of barged my way in and then dragged Gabby in kicking and screaming.
Well, it wasn't so much kicking and screaming, but yeah, one way or another, the I mean, as we've maintained, everyone has the chance to be an official part of the project. Everyone can contribute something to the API, the implementation, to the docs, and I started out initially as just a raw contributor, and Eden ended up giving me the proposition of, hey, if you write the entity API and not implementation at that time, because Mixins was still being figured out, but just the API, and I could become a core developer essentially, and I managed to do that before Thanksgiving. And then I became core developer, and then, well, over the course of, I think, about 8-9 months, I ended up contributing a large majority of the code base and had enough interest to kind of help lead the project.
Huh. So I guess out of the ashes of Bucket, you both kind of got involved with Sponge. like one after the other. And yeah, so but Sponge isn't just I guess Sponge has some, I think, aside from being, I guess open source and open to more contributors, Sponge has some very notable differences from Bucket, including I guess very intentional compatibility with Forge, which is I guess what Sponge Forge is. So you have these different branches. You have Sponge Vanilla and you have Sponge Forge. I guess what exactly kind of inspired that decision?
Well, I think
it's fair to say that we learned lessons from Bucket. Like, this grew out of of the death of Bucket, and everyone was very concerned to not make the same mistakes. Like, one of the key discussions that was had during the next step phase that I was talking about was to kind of discuss, well, what shape should this be? Should we basically try and replicate Bucket, or should we really start fresh with the opportunity to learn from Bucket's deficiencies? And also, one of the project leaders is Blood, who used to write Cauldron, which was an attempt to blend Bucket with Forge so that you could run both Forge mods and Bucket plugins. And it always struggled with the fact that Bucket was just intrinsically not designed with mods in mind, so everything was a compromise. So the key lessons were really, where did Bucket fall down in things like brittleness of its API and its inability to adapt, and what concessions were needed to be made so that the API could handle both vanilla Minecraft and modded Minecraft without having to bend to breaking point.
And when it came to implementation for that, of course, initially we started off with SpongeForge directly, and the project was originally intended only to start with the Forge counterpart. While the API would not be based on Forge, it was, as Adam said, it was heavily designed specifically with mods in mind. So an example is that we have what we call catalog types for different types of things. So like entity types, block types, item types. What else? Bunch of other things. Yeah, you name it. Basically, it's cataloged. And the one power of this is that since Forge already has quite a few registries in its own system, we could, at the time, we piggybacked on it to provide the acknowledgement of the custom modded entity types from mods, and being able to just spawn a modded entity is as simple as just doing a search from what we call the game registry. At one point we found that there was another project called Granite that wanted to implement the Sponge API on a vanilla-based server. And that was born out of the fact that we had no official plans to write a vanilla-based server. But after a short amount of time, we ended up absorbing that project on the basis that we would be able to maintain Sponge Vanilla. And one of the biggest things that happened in about April of 2015 was the unification process of SpongeForge and Sponge Vanilla, because some people might initially think, oh, well, if you're doing SpongeForge and Sponge Vanilla, you just have two different projects that depend on the API. But what we ended up doing was we created a third project called Sponge Common that quite literally shares about 90% of the code base between SpongeForge and Sponge Vanilla, to the point that SpongeForge is probably about 10% of the entire code base. Sponge Common has 80%, the API is another 10, and then Sponge Vanilla, fills in the remaining gaps. So SpongeForge is mostly a project now at this point, a compatibility mod that modifies a few of the things in Forge, adds a lot of the registration management, and particularly to ensure mod compatibility, event management, so that when Sponge throws an event, we can ensure that Forge is getting the same event and we still obey what mods dictate, and vice versa.
Essentially, it means that plugins and mods, when running in a Forge environment, are actually peers. They exist on the same level, so they're both able to interact with each other very seamlessly because the events are all blended together by the nature of our implementation.
Huh. So, say for example, obviously, lots of big modded servers, a big pain for them, I guess, before Sponge has basically been, how to, protections. That's a huge thing. I think that's an example, I'm guessing, of a situation where plugins interacting with mods could help that a lot. Like, in terms of mods respecting, say, like townie protections or something like that.
So, it's good that you bring that up, because that was one of the biggest things that Cauldron had issues with, as you kind of mentioned in the past. A lot of mods are not written to throw events, and the unfortunate aspect of that is it's very difficult to find out when a mod is doing something and why. So when a player, for example, uses a Tinker's Construct hammer and destroys a 3x3 area of stone, while normally you can block the center block, because of the way that Tinker's Construct is written, the other 8 blocks are still going to be broken, or potentially broken. And Blood, the original author of Cauldron, he ended up writing what's now called cause tracking, a system that has been built around in SpongeForge and in SpongeCon for 1.8.9, that essentially, whenever we know something is happening, for example, an entity is ticking, any changes to the world, we know who to blame, and then we throw an event. We throw, for example, change block event for all the blocks that that entity may have changed. The same can go for when players are ticking, or when a player break block packet is sent, and the kind. And one of the really cool things about it is that the initial tests, we were able to totally block out any sort of block changes from anything that you could throw at with Thumbcraft, for example. That was a test done sometime last year. And the system has evolved into something that is really quite robust, to the point that you really have to write a mod that directly modifies chunks in order to bypass the protection system, which obviously server administrators would not be trying to use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess you have this thing. Obviously, Bucket, was so long in the tooth at the point at which, there was the whole licensing issue, that kind of fell apart. And there were things like Collagen that kind of tried to patch together this sort of, compatibility with Forge and stuff. But I guess with Sponge, you kind of decided, instead of maintaining compatibility with the Bucket plugins, we want to create like a new API that will allow stuff like you mentioned, and just better interaction between them. And also, if people want to use it on vanilla servers, they can as well. That kind of, I guess, got added later. But you, I guess you had this vision of kind of, I guess, a new frontier for plugins.
Well, so one of the things that I think we can all agree, is that Bucket was designed such that the API was written once, or with very, very rare backwards incompatibility changes, or backwards incompatible changes. And one of the biggest problems with that is some of the events were part of the problem, and in general, some of the API was another problem. But when Bucket was originally written, we're talking about 5 years ago, close to 6, and a majority of the API never really fully evolved or was added to for the new feature sets that Minecraft was adding over the years. And one of the funniest things is there were some methods, like the infamous update player inventory method was always deprecated because it was said that there was going to be something written to replace it, but that replacement never came. And we really, really did not want to fall down to that rabbit hole of, okay, we can't make backwards incompatible changes when Minecraft changes. One of the more self-evident changes, for example, was in 1.9 when Minecraft added the ability for an entity to have multiple passengers instead of just one passenger. And that change was made, and it's really quite simple. The one way that we achieve that is by using a specific versioning system called Semantic Versioning, where a plugin that is written for one version of Sponge API may break with the next version of Sponge API, provided that any of the API that it uses specifically may have been changed for any reason that Minecraft has updated, or we found a better way to write some specific part of the API.
So you make it very clear if a plugin, like the semantic versioning, it like following certain conditioning or rules, if this number is here, that means this plugin's not going to work with a newer version of Sponge.
It may not work. That's the key word, may, because for example, right now we're working on Sponge API 5, and the latest stable is Sponge API 4.1 release. The difference is that between Sponge API 3, for example, and Sponge API 4, there were some minor changes to how chat was being handled. Specifically, we had a system that wasn't really flexible for having multiple what we call message channels. So, for example, if you open up a PM with a friend that's on your server, that can be a specific message channel that can be statically referenced, or just instantly referenced across the entire duration that both players are online. But one of the things is that any plugin that was simply working with, for example, change block event, that plugin wouldn't have broken because the change block event specifically has not changed at all from 3.0 to 4.0, or from 4.0 to 5.0, for example. So of course, you really want to, with plugins, you really want to focus on what is the API release versus the Minecraft version, because we can have multiple API versions during the life cycle of one Minecraft version.
So I guess you're prioritizing expanding your API in favor of having plugins work across multiple versions.
Well,
But during the beta phase, partially yes. The idea is that the API has to change as Minecraft changes, because stagnating and refusing to change while Minecraft adds a new feature or makes a huge change to the underlying framework, that bit we can't say, yeah, you write it's just like with a Forge mod. You can't just write a Forge mod for 1.7.10 and expect it to work with 1.10.
Right.
The same treatment has to be given to the API to an extent that your plugin will work for that entirety of that API's lifetime. Whereas, for example, right now, one of our long-term service versions is Sponge API 4 because it is the last API version for 1.8.9. And there are a lot of Forge servers that are still residing on 1.8.9. And you can develop a plugin for Sponge API 4 and it'll still work until 1.8.9 port has been completely dropped. But the API 4 has no breaking changes between the minor versions. There's only API additions that can be made, but no breaking changes within that API major version.
Huh. And I guess, does that mean, could you have the same API across different versions of Minecraft? Like, meaning that a plugin could theoretically work on different versions?
Potentially. For example, if we actually did make a release for Minecraft 1.9, and we didn't have any more breaking changes moving forward, it would have been perfectly well suitable for Sponge API 5 to have supported both Minecraft 1.9 and 1.10.
And I guess one of the things, so you're kind of paralleling Forge more in the sense that, like, if you make a change, the plugin kind of has to adapt to that change if it wants to stay on the new API version. But I guess going from 1.7.10, because in terms of the client, like non-vanilla with mod packs, the community has kind of been staying on that version for a while, and we're just now finally moving off it. And 1.7, of course, was also the last version in which we had Bucket, or also, I guess, the unofficial Cauldron, and then Thermos, and those further kind of efforts to combine Forge and Bucket. That was kind of basically their last dying breath. So going to 1.10, I guess, I think for many people, it's probably the first time, like for server owners, that they're going to be working with Sponge if they have a modded server. So do you think this is like a big period for you?
It's definitely a growing period. We haven't stopped growing. Every single day we see there's new server administrators coming into our RSC channels on our forums, asking for help on how to set up Sponge Forge, or providing a stack trace for an issue that is happening with some mod incompatibility. There's definitely the tested guarantee that SpongeForge can work very, very well. There was a demonstration done about a month ago or so on a Pixelmon server that had something like 60 online players, and the crate was still 20 TPS with all the bells and whistles, all the protection plugin functionality working, titles, kits, everything. You really can't go much further than saying, yeah, here's SpongeForge, we provide this API, here's our plugins, that work. And because of the implementation designs that we've design decisions that we've made from the start, we've been able to add what we call mix-in plugins. Though Mumfrey doesn't quite like the term because it's not really the same as what an actual mix-in plugin is supposed to be. But we've added various optimization fixes, such as entity collision limitations or entity activation range. I've made a couple myself, some that are specific to methods that are called on the world or on the chunk provider, to kind of give them a little boost in terms of how many times they are being called for the performance that they are required of. But server administrators, we definitely want to help them as much as we can with regards to, if they want to use Sponge, great. If they don't want to use Sponge and just want to use their Forge servers, then that's fine. But they're it's definitely showing that people are getting word of Sponge, and they're kind of realizing that it's probably the next step for them.
Yeah, I guess like
Totally did not intend to tie into next step, but
well, you made a pun there, I guess.
yeah.
Design-wise, like in terms of how it works, what do you think are some of the biggest lessons you've kind of learned from server owners in this period of, I guess, you're still not quite finished, obvious, or I guess it's won't ever really be finished, but you're still in the early stages of it. So I think what are the main lessons you've learned from server administrators and just users of Sponge as you've been continuously developing it?
There's a lot that we've learned. One of the biggest things that I guess we've learned is that we really have to appreciate that Mumfrey has developed mixins to be as powerful as it is, and he's continuing to make it even more powerful, because the changes that we can, or rather the way that we implement our API and the majority of our systems through mixins really ensures a high percentage of compatibility with virtually every single mod. The only exceptions are certain few core mods that if some
poorly
people are
written.
aware, core mods are able to transform the bytecode at runtime. And the unfortunate part is that some mod developers have written their what we call class transformers, not in the cleanest of ways, and because of the way that Mixins attempts to ensure that all our injections, all our redirects, all our implementations are being applied properly, sometimes one of our critical injections are not being applied, and then it's
But
like,
we can
well,
detect that.
yeah,
That's
we
the
can
crucial
detect
thing.
it. And of course, we get issue or bug reports saying, "Yay, SpongeForge is not compatible with X mod." Like there was a time when SpongeForge was not compatible with extra utilities too, because of extra utilities to class loading a certain class like far too early in the.
Can I jump in and give some
Yeah,
context? Because you're getting into specifics without real any.
go ahead.
So I'm not sure how much you guys would be aware of how CraftBucket used to do things, but CraftBucket being having control of its entire vertical, it was patched into the Minecraft source code, and those post-patched classes were then shipped as as the CraftBucket jar that you would run. That was one of the biggest problems, because obviously it means that to a large degree, CraftBucket was always redistributing Mojang's code, and that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
The approach used by Forge and Lightloader and other more modern platforms is actually to just take the raw Minecraft jar. So we never redistribute Mojang's code. We take the Minecraft jar as it is, and then when it's loaded, we apply our changes to it. So it's kind of a runtime patching. This gives you a lot more legal stability in terms of, because you're not distributing any copyrighted code, you're just making changes to it at runtime. And it also gives you a lot more power in terms of being able to. So Forge doesn't leverage this, because Forge just makes a kind of it very much just makes patches to the base Minecraft game. What Gabizou is talking about in terms of transformers are more dynamic little bits of software that can basically make specific changes to a specific class or multiple classes at runtime. And this is how pretty much all you've heard of core mods. That's basically what they do. They will take something they want to interact with. Say they want to add an extra thing into the Minecraft GUI, or they want to add some extra behavior to an entity. They can literally patch that right in at runtime. Again, they're still never modifying the underlying Mojang jar. It's just being changed as it's loaded at runtime. obviously, if you're wanting to change the whole game, that's a massive undertaking, and without some kind of library or framework to do that, then those changes can rapidly become unmaintainable. Fortunately for a lot of core mods, they're only maybe changing one or two things. Obviously, what Sponge is doing is it's pretty much interacting with every single aspect of the game. And so the framework that we're using is Mixin. We've mentioned this a lot, but haven't really explained what it is. Basically, what Mixin is a runtime patching system that allows us to put our changes in. And that's why we're able to do that on top of Vanilla or on top of Forge, because we've got our pre-packaged code that makes the changes, and really it doesn't care whether it's making those changes to a Forge, a pre-patched Forge game
Environment.
or a vanilla one. It just goes, oh, here's code, I need to add this stuff in. And because it's intelligent about how it's doing that, it can detect when the code has changed in an incompatible way. Like, for example, if something that it needs to hook into has been removed or changed or, had
Replaced.
replaced in some cases. And so that's why the mixins are a powerful system, because not only do they allow us to structure our code nicely and make it maintainable for us, which is obviously great in terms of getting people to contribute, and also for auditing. They're not just looking at patches, they're looking at, understandable Java code. It also means that when stuff breaks, we can instantly detect that and we know that there's an incompatibility. So that's kind of the current state of the technology that we're using. And really, the opportunities that we've had most since this has become more, since people have been trying to use it in mod packs, is really just seeing the kind of incompatible changes that people are making. And in some cases, we can ask them nicely to change it so that they're not. And in other cases, we can adapt. And in terms of the feedback that we're getting, that's probably the most valuable stuff that we're experiencing at the moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, Sponge has been a huge project, involving people from all across basically the Minecraft community. People from the Craft Bucket working on plugins for that, people working on Forge mods, people, not even involved in other stuff, like all basically, all corners of the community you have kind of involved in this huge project. I guess, do you think that helps with, I guess, kind of understanding what people want, like in the sense that I guess let me be more specific, in the sense that, like, and people, do you think people want something I guess more than just what they were getting with Bucket, but at the same time, they want to be able to have a modded server, and of course they want to have their protections and permissions and whatever, but you're also kind of giving, do you think it's gonna, that Sponge is giving kind of server administrators something, I guess, new enough to the point that it's not just a continuation of Bucket, it's actually its own kind of thing on top of Forge now, or I guess on top of Vanilla. Do you think it's going to, I guess, open up servers in that sense?
Absolutely.
Definitely.
To a big degree as well. It's not just because many of us have been server administrators in the past, and it's particularly interesting to see the kind of things that people writing plugins are asking for. Like, quite often someone will be making a plugin to do something that they want to do on their server, or something they want to do on their friend's server, and the plugin author, who is really the absolute best person to come to us, because they generally understand the workings of the API too. So they're able to come and say, hey, it would be really cool if the API did this. Can you add this feature? And that kind of just bubbles through to the actual server administrators, because we can improve their quality of life by giving the features that the plugins need to them.
Yeah.
So,
and I guess, do you I guess, because you mentioned before how like this is going to change modded servers a lot, but do you also, I guess, do you see this as, like, for stuff like, say, big vanilla servers, Hypixel, Mindplex, and that, that stuff, or maybe the ones, I know some of those guys use custom stuff, but do you think that, like, lots of large, vanilla-oriented servers, which typically have the largest player bases, unless you're counting Pixelmon, do you think that those are also kind of going to adopt Sponge?
Well,
go on.
So I have some idea as to what larger networks have to go through. So as many people are familiar at this point, there's the bucket or the craft bucket fork called Spigot. And with the way that Spigot is built and managed, it's very much like Forge, where it applies various patches onto not just the Minecraft codebase or decompiled Minecraft codebase, but also Craft Bucket's codebase. And the biggest problem with that is the way that you have to develop. You not only develop that, you have to how should I say? You have to the way you have to just build the entire system is just it's a maintenance nightmare, especially when you have to move between versions because you have to deal with obfuscation changes, you have to deal with patches being rewritten, and the way that mixins that we write with mixins is it's still Java code. All the injections, all the transformations, they're still written in ways that you can easily see, oh, that injection needs to be slightly modified. I don't need to rewrite this entire thing, generate the patch, and then ship it. I just need to change this one little line, and that's it. Commit it, done. And with mixins, actually recently we've added the capability for plugins to provide mixins, such that server networks would perfectly well be able to use Sponge as a base and provide their own mixins to modify, small parts of the server, the entire game, swap out entire functionalities to do specifically what they want. And it's very well possible for those server networks to to start developing all these changes, develop them as mixin plugins specifically, and they just chuck it into the plugins or mods folder and boot it up, and there's no redistribution or recompiling or remodification of Sponge Forge or Sponge Vanilla to the extent that they've had to do with Spigot.
To actually answer the original question, yes, they are. We had a presence at Minecon this past year, and one of the more interesting classes of conversation we had during that time was with people approaching us who are developers for the large server networks, because they were feeling very vulnerable, or feeling extremely apprehensive about where the Bucket ecosystem would go. That after the collapse of Craft Bucket as a project, they're obviously concerned because they're businesses. They want a stable platform, and they didn't feel that there was one there. We weren't making any claims at the time of being a go-to product right then, because how much people trust the project is critical. We don't want to claim one thing that's not true and then have people come over to our project and go, this isn't finished, this isn't ready. So until we were comfortable that the project was ready for beta, we were being very honest and upfront, and that attitude was extremely welcomed by the people that we spoke to, the developers from these networks. In particular, they were absolutely made up with the straightforward structuring of the product, where we have Sponge API, Sponge Common, and then the two individual effectively compatibility layers. Really loved the fact that we were being so transparent about all of our development efforts, and the fact that we were really going out of our way to do the things that Gabby's just described, such as providing much better workflows for these kind of teams. Because essentially what Gabby was getting at is the issue that these teams generally have is that it's an extremely brittle and not particularly polished workflow that very much tangles their code with the code that they're modifying, whereas as I potentially described to you in my when talking about mixins a few minutes ago, by providing the same technology that we're using to make Sponge to the end user, we're giving them a brilliant platform to build their own modifications on in such a way that they have the same flexibility that Sponge itself does. So when it comes to a new version and they're potentially making changes to the core game on top of what we're doing, they literally have the exact same amount of power of veto that we do. They can literally go in right down to the levels of the internals, but they've got the full power of mixing at their available to them. They've got the full power of Forge core mods if they choose that. And on top of that, the actual workflow is based on MCP, which is an extremely well supported project, which provides all of the tool chain and workflow that you could possibly hope for. And our project is very much owes its existence to the just how good this tool chain is. And so having it was reassuring. I think that was the best way to put it. Was a lot of people felt very reassured that that we were building this product that's going to basically not be a drop-in replacement, but very much be an upgrade and an improvement to their workflow.
Yeah, I mean, like 1.7 Plus, I think, was such an uncertain time for server developers. I mean, first of all, obviously there was the EULA stuff, which is a whole different issue. And then there was the whole craft bucket licensing issue. And now I guess you're kind of you had this development style, and you have all these amazing things with Sponge that are kind of leading them into it. Do you think, I guess, 1.8 and it was 1.8 and 1.9 and 1.10 to some degree. They weren't great times exactly for modders either. Forge had to do a lot of work, and so did modders to kind of get adapted to those versions. And now we're just finally kind of getting over that hill. So do you think that was that like as much of a struggle for you, or did that give you, I guess, like more time, or I guess more perspective to kind of refine Sponge?
The main struggle for modders, just for context, the main struggle for modders, in particular going to 1.8, was the fact that Mojang pretty much gutted and rewrote the rendering engine. This was why the early versions of the 1.8 client were so unperformant, because they had massive issues with the new technology that they'd adopted. From server-side points of view, the changes were less drastic. So potentially for projects that were merely targeting the server side of things, so Sponge, Bucket, etc., there were obviously things like block states and that to tackle, which was a big internal change. But in terms of the things that were really a massive hurdle for mods, those kind of huge hurdles weren't such a massive problem for server-side technologies.
And I guess more generally, in terms of the Sponge project, like I mentioned, and like you mentioned, you have so many people involved with this. Sponge isn't really, it's not just one thing. It's not just, oh, this is just a Forge mod that, or an API layer, or it's not just craft bucket replacement. It's not just whatever. You have so many things going on. I mean, it's simple and understandable, but you have lots of sub-projects going on. Like you have Ore, which is your I guess repository system that you're working on for plugins to kind of showcase themselves. You have all this stuff going on. I guess what is it like to kind of organize and work with that from like an organizational perspective?
I think Gabby is probably more qualified to answer that one. The one thing I will mention is, just off the back of what you just said, again, a lot of the reason that those things exist is lessons learned from Bucket. For example, documentation project that Sponge has is front and center in our efforts. That this project is no use if coders can't get into the new paradigms, and if server admins can't find the information that they need. So things like docs, things like having an open source repository, those kind of things were all, again, just lessons that were learnt from the frustrations that people felt with Bucket. In particular, Craft Bucket was always felt to be quite opaque in that it was kept to a kind of inner circle of developers. We've addressed that by having bi-monthly live streams where we talk about what's changed and actually have people interact with us on stream and be able to ask us questions and demo all the new things. In terms of how we organize it, that's Gabby's bag. You need to ask him about that one.
It's kind of been a learning experience for everyone, I think. But it's mostly, as Adam said, it's very much that we just didn't. We saw some of the issues that that Bucket had, not only as an API, but as an organization and a stance, really, with some of the communities, and specifically, we just wanted something that we can truly be proud of, not as an egotistical way, but as a, here is something that we are going to encourage you to use if you want. Hey, you like Minecraft? Hey, you want to use plugins? Hey, you want to use Forge mods? Here's Sponge. Hey, you're a plugin developer? Great. We've got documentation, galore. We've got people that are ready, basically, to answer most all of your questions. Or if you found a bug, one of our developers will fix the bug shortly. It's more of the organization itself is, I don't want to say it's like a family, but it's very much treating itself and acting in a way that encourages the community to, rather not encourages the community, but welcomes the community at large, not just, those that are already privy to Sponge's community. And I guess the main reasoning is just that we don't want to we don't want to be shy to the public. We don't want to dissuade people from ever asking questions, because everyone always has questions. Not like everyone's going to instantly know, oh, I should go read the Sponge docs. I should read the Java docs. I should set up an entire Forge implementation workspace just to find out how this works. I can just simply ask a question and not be attacked for it, type of thing. I'm not sure if that actually answered the question.
I think that's what I was looking for, and it's definitely clear that you guys have your long-term stuff figured out. Sponge even now feels so new, probably especially to, the server owners and administrators who, let's just say time kind of moves slower or moves differently for lots of them, because it is, like running a business essentially. But, Sponge has already kind of been in the works for a few years, or a couple of years, I guess, and it looks like it's going to have a bright future. It's a great time to be not only a mod developer, but a plugin developer right now, because very exciting things going on. Where do you see the roadmap leading, I guess, in the near future?
Near future, we're definitely going to have a 1.10 release. Before Minecon, we're going to have quite a few things that we can demonstrate as to the power of Sponge and mixins. Long term, we really do hope to we really do hope to have a probably about 95% of the entire API implemented without additions requiring drastic changes to our systems. Some semblance of calm because for the last 2 years, the API has been changing, not because we hate people, not because we hate developers, but because we find that while we start implementing certain aspects of the API, we end up realizing how much that bit of the API needs to change because the implementation really doesn't work that way that we wrote the API to be expected. Long term, I kind of hate speculation, mostly because Adam has taught me to stop speculating and just go with the flow. Only plan for what you know, not for what you hope for.
I think this is another thing, though, is, whilst it's undergone some fairly radical redesigns in key areas over the last couple of years, while we've not been afraid to admit that we're wrong when something needs to change to be better. As Gabby said, it's going to stabilize, and in particular because some of the most radical overhauls have been to, again, learning from Bucket, try to remove bits of the API which are potentially tightly coupled to how things are now, and make them more descriptive in their behavior, such that as Gabby said right at the beginning, things like everything being cataloged, it just makes the API intrinsically less brittle. It makes it intrinsically more flexible because you're putting in the very fabric of the thing that stuff might change. You're essentially saying right now, hey, this is what's available, stuff might change. And by encoding that in the actual fabric of the API, it does make for a much more stable long-term proposition, because plugins can, even if they don't work across the boundary, still gracefully continue to work in the aspects that they are able to. And that's really just been the whole foundation of our design philosophy, is be very pragmatic about it now with a view to making it much more stable in the long run. And so people are going to, particularly plugin developers who really experience a certain amount of fatigue, and you've kind of touched on this with what you mentioned about mod developers having trouble jumping to 1.8 and then jumping to 1.9. People get into modding because they're enthusiastic about it, and then they find that the update cycle is just like a vampire for their enthusiasm. It's just they experience update fatigue, and it's entirely fair that they do so, because it can be extremely demoralizing to write something that you're proud of and find a month down the line that it no longer works anymore. And that's why you end up with these kind of stickiness on one version, that followed by a leap forward as people finally get over that resistance to updating and sort of jump forward. And this is exactly what we saw from 1.5, that a lot of servers stayed on 1.5.2 for an extremely long period of time because the changes to 1.6 were so fundamental. I wouldn't be surprised if there are still 1.5.2 servers out there running somewhere.
I'm sure there are.
Really what we want to do is kind of try to, as much as it's possible without making the API so convoluted that nobody wants to use it, encode flexibility into the very shape of the API so that fatigue can be lessened, so that people can write code which is, almost polymorphic in nature, almost, intrinsically adaptable by the way it's written. And that's really what we're trying to promote. And we haven't charged at this, as you say. We've been working at this steadily and just absolutely devotedly for nearly 2 years now. We've built some brand new technologies from the ground up, which we made available to other people. Other people in the Forge modding sphere are actually now adopting our technology because they realize that it's a really good way of going about it. So we're giving back to the community in that way too. And yeah, we're not going out there and saying, hey, we're the best, come use us. We're saying, hey, we've really thought about this. If you're looking for a stable long-term solution made by people who actually care, made by people who've been thinking about how this works out long-term, that's what Sponge is.
Huh. Well, yeah, that definitely sounds good, and I think you have, I don't know, I mean, like Minecraft, there's this theme, obviously, like you mentioned, fatigue sometimes with all these updates. They mess a lot of stuff up, but, obviously, Sponge has survived this long, there's a lot of enthusiasm for it, and I see no reason why it won't survive another 2 years, or, you know, beyond that, of course. So, yeah, thank you, both of you, so much for coming on, and I guess before we close out, do you have any, final thoughts?
I know that Inscrutable would hate me if I didn't mention Flard, but if you do ever have the curiosity to find out more about Sponge, you know, there are definitely people around that are willing to help you out, answer questions, and Flard is going to be forever one of the keywords as to the how should I say? Help me out, Adam.
The spirit, I guess.
The spirit, yeah. The spirit of Sponge itself is powered by Flard. No one knows what it is, and no one will tell you what it is. It's mystifying.
But yeah, no, just thank you for interviewing us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been awesome having you guys on. This was a bit of a longer episode, but I think we had some really interesting discussion. And I think for those of you still watching at this point, you probably, hopefully, very much enjoyed this episode. So, yeah, obviously, I guess if this was your first experience with Sponge, hopefully you came away with something good. And if this wasn't, which will probably be the case for a lot of you, then hopefully you learned a little more about it. And yeah. I guess, yeah, Sponge looks like it's very active. You guys, you know, have Discord, forums, you have everything. So yeah, all of you watching, I guess, don't be a stranger. But yeah, thank you, both of you, so much for coming on. It's been nice having you on. Been a nice, longer episode. I think people will enjoy this. And I guess, yeah, thank you, all of you guys, for watching. And see you in the next one. Goodbye.